Chapter 10, 9:50 a.m. Dad told Lucas that he'd driven to Manhattan from Randall's Island as soon as the first plane hit. I was going to head right to the scene, Dad said, but I got the message that you were at the firehouse, so I went there first. Chief said you'd be waiting for me. I'm sorry, Lucas said. I just couldn't stay. Dad held up his hand. There was no time to talk, and Lucas got the idea that nothing that had happened before this morning mattered anymore. Not now, and maybe not ever again. We need to find the guys, Dad said. I need to get my gear from the truck, and then I'm going to find someone to take you back to the firehouse. Lucas didn't want to go back there, but he didn't argue. They're not going to be able to put the fires out, Dad said. This is a rescue operation now. We just want to get all of the people out of there. Dad's walkie-talkie crackled. Muffled voices mixed with static came through. Dad kept switching channels, trying to hear. He swore under his breath. Nobody can talk to anyone, he said. These radios have never worked, and now people are totally shut off. Nobody can get through to the men in the towers. They passed a pickup truck. The back was completely smashed, and a jet engine, still smoking, sat on the ground just behind it. The driver's door was open. Someone had been in that car when it was hit and had gotten away. Whew, lucky, Dad said as he pulled Lucas along past the truck. 1 mile per hour slower, and the entire cab would have been crushed. There were people sitting on sidewalks being treated by paramedics. Some were in bad shape. Lucas tried to keep his eyes straight ahead. A woman staggered up to Dad, her gray hair soaked with sweat. Her face was bright red with streaks of black under her eyes. She was breathing very hard with her hand on her chest. "Can you help me?" she gasped. "My heart! I came down the stairs. My friends! I don't know where they are." There was so much smoke. Lucas knew Dad didn't want to stop. He wanted to find his crew. "Okay," Dad said in a gentle voice. "Don't worry. We're going to get you what you need." He turned to Lucas, pointing to an ambulance a few yards away. "Tell one of the paramedics we need help here." Lucas ran over and told one of the paramedics, then hurried back to sit with Dad and the woman. Dad kept talking to her while they waited. He introduced himself and asked for her name and about her family. The woman was gripping Dad's arm so tightly that her fingernails were digging into his skin. Dad didn't budge. He kept talking to her, trying to claim this person he'd never met and probably would never see again. Finally, the paramedics came. A minute later, they had the woman on a stretcher and into the ambulance. Dad and Lucas continued their search for ladder 177, but suddenly there was a deep roaring noise. The ground trembled. Dad stopped short. He looked around. His eyes flew up. He grabbed Lucas by the arm and shouted, "Run!" Lucas had no idea what was happening, but suddenly there was the loudest noise he'd ever heard. Louder than 100 freight trains, louder than all those sirens. "What is it?" Lucas cried, his voice cracking with terror. Dad pulled Lucas along, shouting, "Run! Run!" to all the people around. Dad kept looking over his shoulder, pulling Lucas harder, urging him to move faster. They came to a convenience store and Dad pushed the door open. He threw Lucas inside and then called to the people just behind them. "I'm here," he called. "Hurry, hurry! In here!" Just a few people followed, then Dad slammed the door shut. "Everyone, get down! Cover your heads!" Lucas dove to the ground, and then, whoosh! There was the sound of shattering glass and a powerful blast of hot wind. Minutes passed. Lucas squeezed his eyes shut and covered his ears. His mouth and nose filled with gritty dust. It was hard to breathe. If he hadn't known better, he would have been sure that he was in the middle of a tornado, a boiling hot tornado. And suddenly, the noise and wind stopped. There was silence. Lucas opened his eyes, but he couldn't see anything. All around was pure darkness. For a long moment, he was pretty sure that the world had ended and that he was the only person left on Earth. Chapter 11. It was Dad's voice that broke the silence. "Lucas!" Dad shouted. "Dad!" Lucas rasped, spitting dust from his mouth. "Is anyone hurt?" Dad called. People coughed and hacked and sniffed, but nobody seemed to be badly hurt. Dust was everywhere. It coated Lucas, every inch of him. It was in his nose, between his teeth, stuck to his tongue, in the back of his throat. This wasn't like regular dust. Some of the grains were jagged bits of ground glass. When Lucas tried to brush himself off, the dust cut into his skin. "I have a light," Dad said in a calm, quiet voice. "I'm going to turn it on. Follow the light and come to me. We're going to stay together. We're all going to be all right." There was a click, then a glow of small yellow circle. It looked like the moon on a foggy night. The air was filled with white floating dust. To Lucas, it seemed like they were trapped inside of a snow globe. There were 4 other people in the store with him and Dad, 2 women and 2 men. The younger of the men came from behind the counter of the store. He worked there. Dad asked everyone their names. "I want you to put a piece of clothing in front of your mouth," he told them. "It's not good to breathe this dust." Lee, the store worker, got big bottles of water for everyone. And rolls of paper towels. Everyone rinsed their mouths. Dad soaked the paper towel carefully, washed Lucas's eyes and face. Then he helped the others. Catherine, the younger of the 2 women, was crying. The other people comforted her. "What was that?" Catherine sobbed. "Was there another plane? Someone said there was another plane." "No," Dad said. "That was not a plane. I think that the top part of the building must have come down." The door was stuck. Dad kicked out the jagged glass that clung to the door frame. He stepped out first, then turned to help everyone through out of the store. Dad had told them he wanted them to move quickly. The 4 strangers started walking, holding hands, but Dad stopped just outside the store. His hand clamped to Lucas's shoulder, staring at the scene of destruction all around them. It seemed to be much worse south of them, where even through the fog of dust, Lucas could see the twisted steel beams and the big chunks of concrete that filled the streets. Cars were on fire. Fire trucks, ambulances were smashed. A few sirens still squawked, but it sounded like the trucks were even crying out for help. All around them, people climbed out of the windows and doorways. Everyone was coated with white dust. Lucas thought of a book he had read about World War II last year. There were pictures of cities that had been bombed and burned to the ground. That's what this scene reminded him of. War. Dad was looking intently south, like he was searching for something. "It's gone," he said in a voice so soft that only Lucas could hear. "What's gone?" Lucas said. "One of the towers," Dad said. The entire building collapsed. Nothing around them looked like the wreckage of a collapsed 110-story building. Where were the big hunks of glass and steel, the smashed office furniture and computers, the miles of wires and pipes? "Where is it?" Lucas said. There was nothing but dust. "It's all around us," Dad said. The dust, Lucas realized, that was the tower. It was practically all that was left. Lucas tried not to think about how many people might still be in the buildings, the men and women working there, the hundreds of firefighters and police and paramedics who were on the scene, Georgie and Mark, Uncle Benny. Lucas tried not to think about people who might have been in that building when it came down. Dad would have been in there too if he hadn't come to the firehouse looking for Lucas. Dad took Lucas's hand and held it tight. "We need to move fast," he said. The other tower, Lucas realized, if the first one could fall, the second one could fall too. And so they began their march north, Dad and Lucas together. The dust cleared as they reached Chambers Street. All of a sudden, the world was bright again, and it didn't matter, Lucas realized. It didn't matter how far they walked or how much time went by. Nothing would ever be the same again. All right, chapter 12. This one takes place on Sunday, November 4th, 2001, 2:15 p.m. So we're a couple months after 9/11. The air was crisp and chilly. Lucas stood at the edge of the field. The sounds of football filled the air. The cheers of the crowd, the thrill of the ref's whistle, the laughs of little kids playing tag in front of the snack bar. Mom and Dad were up in the bleachers. They waved at him. A player ran off the field for a drink of water. "Hey, Lucas," he said. It was James, one of Mark's twins. Lucas had finally learned to tell them apart. "Hey, buddy," Lucas said. "Great game." The little boy smiled up through his face mask. Lucas held out his hand to high five, and the kid gave it a good whack. James ran back out on the field. Lucas turned, hoping James didn't see the tears in his eyes. He needed just a few seconds to pull himself together. He was getting better at it. And besides, he had known this would be a tough day. This was the first game since Mark's funeral. The stands were filled with Ladder 177 guys and their families, all cheering for Mark's boys. Lucas was helping out the new coach. Some guys kept calling for Lucas from the stands. Half the Jaguars had come too. Lucas wasn't on the team anymore, but he hadn't lost football or the guys. He took a deep breath. Yes, this was going to be a tough day, but a good one. Dad had told Lucas it would get easier as time passed. He didn't mean easy. It meant there would be minutes like these when he wasn't buried by sadness, when he wasn't struck in terror of that day in September, when he didn't think about the planes or the thousands of people who had died in the towers, or the faces of the men who'd planned the attacks. The worst memories were from after he and Dad had escaped the dust, when they finally made it to the firehouse. Each hour had brought a new horror. The second tower collapsing, news that a plane had crashed into the Pentagon outside Washington, D.C., and that another plane had been heading for the Capitol or the White House but had crashed in Pennsylvania. There were also the moments when they found out about Mark, then Georgie, then Chief. The other men had made it back one by one, covered in dust and ash, some dripping with blood. But that afternoon, there was only one man missing: Uncle Benny. The guys had seen him running into Tower 1, determined to get to the burning floors so he could get as many people out as he could. Lucas could see the doom in the eyes of the other men as they talked about Uncle Benny, but he'd sat on the floor of the firehouse, his eyes glued to the floor, waiting, praying. Dad had been right there with him. That was the one good thing that had come out of that day. Lucas and Dad, they'd marched out of the dust holding hands and just kept on marching together. Last week, Dad even brought up the Seagrave model from the basement. The real rig was wrecked, so Dad figured they should finish the model one and bring it to the firehouse. They worked on it some nights when neither of them could sleep. Sometimes Mom would sit with them. All they had to do now was paint it. The score of the game was tied in the fourth quarter. The other team called a timeout. The kids all ran to the sidelines surrounding their coach. He stood there with his cane, his left arm in a sling, his shamrock tattoo peeping out from the top of the cast. Who's the new coach? Who is it? Uncle Benny. "We have some champions here," he boomed, turning to wink at Lucas. Yes, Uncle Benny had made it out. He'd come down the stairs of the North Tower a minute before it collapsed, carrying a wounded man on his back. He got himself and the man under an engine truck and saved both of their lives. He was in bad shape when he crawled out. Shattered ankle, busted arm, collapsed lung. He was rushed to the hospital. Word didn't reach the firehouse until early in the evening. That is one memory that Lucas kept in his heart, the moment he heard that Uncle Benny was safe. Lucas walked over as the kids ran back onto the field. Uncle Benny had dropped his cane, so he leaned on Lucas as they stood and watched the kids play. Their quarterback took the ball and then hurled it. It was a terrible pass, impossible to catch. But James took off after it. The crowd stood and cheered. Uncle Benny and Lucas laughed as they watched James go, go, go. Mark's little boy ran with all his might, his legs pumping, his arms reaching up, his face turned fearlessly toward the bright blue sky. The end.